Welcome back, VITA volunteers. As you may remember, if you just finished watching our Volunteer Standards of Conduct slideshow, we had a slide that covered 10 quality site requirements. And on that slide, one of the requirements was that we were going to follow a certain process. And we did have a very brief overview of what that process would be, with the promise of more information to come. Well, here's the more information that we were talking about. And just in case you are wondering where this information came from, it is covered in IRS Publication 5101. To begin, every VITA TCE site has a basic flow. I like to call it the basic client flow as opposed to, say, the basic return flow, because I think it's important that we remember our clients are involved in this process every step of the way. We first intake our clients, we interview them, and then the return is prepared. And if we're doing facilitated self-assist, our clients are doing the actual preparation of their return. If we are a typical preparation site, then one of the volunteers is doing the preparation of the return. But the client is still involved in that. And then, of course, we have our quality review. So intake has two basic components. We are going to verify the identity of the taxpayer, our client, and we are going to ensure that Form 13614C is complete. And if you remember from our Volunteer Standards of Conduct course, that's just our intake form. It's like an organizer for our clients and for us. It is important that we see proof of our client's identity so that we are helping to guard against identity theft. Sometimes an unscrupulous individual will use another taxpayer's ID number to file a fraudulent return for a big refund that is then routed to that fraudster. When the taxpayer tries to file the authentic return, it gets rejected by the IRS because a return with that ID has already been filed. Now, although this situation can be resolved for the taxpayer, it certainly causes them a lot of worry and extra work. And it is our job to make sure that that does not happen through our site. So that is why we check the identity of our clients. The acceptable forms of identification are first that it must be a photo identification. And things that it could be are things like a valid driver's license, a state-issued ID, an employer ID, school or military ID, a visa, or a passport. Now, if the taxpayer cannot validate their identity, which can sometimes happen for a variety of reasons, we make no judgments, but unfortunately, their return would be out of scope for our program. On to the second part of our intake process, we fill out Form 13614C, and this is to ensure the accuracy of our returns and also help us do our due diligence. It needs to be prepared with each and every return, and it can be mostly completed by the taxpayer beforehand, or it can be completed with a volunteer. It does need to be completed, and that means that all of the questions get answered. And if anything gets marked unsure by the taxpayer, it will need to be discussed and changed to either a yes or no, and we'll see more about that later. It is used during the interview and quality review process. You'll see on the name of it, intake, interview, and quality review sheet. And again, that's just to really make sure that our returns are accurate and that we have asked all the questions that we should be asking. Let's take a closer look at the intake form. Now, if you are looking really closely, you might notice that the date in the upper left-hand corner is from the previous filing year. And that is because at the time of this recording, that was the most recent version of the form. We like to get an early start on training, so for some lessons, we will be ahead of the updated IRS VITA publications, which are typically updated in October or November.
That's okay for these first few lessons. We don't see a lot of changes year to year. And in this lesson, we are just going over the basic structure of this form. So if something does change later, I feel confident that, we'll get up to speed. No problem. So our first section here is just some instructions and reminders, and those are there for the taxpayer if they are filling out the form ahead of time by themselves. I do want you to note that there again is that email address that we discussed in our Volunteer Standards of Conduct course. So now we are not just encouraging our volunteers to report unethical action, we are also encouraging our clients to as well. The second part of the form, which is actually part one, is where we collect all of the taxpayer's personal information. So names, dates, addresses, and a few general questions that kind of help the return get started. Part two is about marital status and some household information. And the form is designed for the taxpayer to include everybody who lives with them or that they support who does not live with them. And this is regardless of whether the taxpayer actually thinks that they can or will claim those persons on their return. And then after that, the volunteer fills out this gray box in the lower right corner to determine who can actually be claimed on the return out of all those people.
Page 2 of our intake form begins with Part 3, Income, and this is where we collect all the sources of income that our taxpayer had over the course of the year. Now you'll note that on the left-hand side there are check boxes. There's a column for yes, a column for no, and a column for unsure. As our taxpayer fills this out, they might check unsure for some of the questions. Later in the process, when we get to the interview stage, we're going to ask them about all of those unsure questions, and we are going to change the answer to either yes or no. We will not be leaving anything left unsure. I also want you to note that between the ordinal number of each question and where the question actually begins, there's a little letter with parentheses around it. And these letters denote certification level that a volunteer needs to have in order to be part of the process of that return. So A for advanced, B for basic, M for military. You need to make sure that before you are doing something with this return, whether it's preparing, whether it's answering questions, or whether it's doing a quality review, that this return is within the scope of your certification. Part 4 is expenses. These are expenses that might be able to lower the taxpayer's tax amount or their taxable income. Part 5 is for life events, and very often these are things that have happened over the year that might qualify our taxpayer for a certain credit. Page 3 begins with additional questions for the return. So these are mostly if you're getting a refund, how would you like that refund? And if you're going to have to pay, how would you like to pay? The next section is demographic questions, and note that these questions are optional. They do not need to be filled out. And then we have some space for notes and notices. The notes can be used by you if you need to communicate some information to the quality reviewer about a certain situation that had a little more context or detail. Maybe the taxpayer wants to give you some context or detail or ask questions in those additional notes. And then of course the notices are things like, the Privacy Act and the Reduction of Paperwork Act with more paperwork, but that's okay. The final page of our intake form is actually not Form 13614C, it's Form 15080, but it's all part of the same packet. So it's the consent to disclose tax return information to VITA and TCE tax preparation sites, and we're required to give this to our taxpayers. They are not required to sign it in order to have their taxes done. This is optional. We have to give it. They can sign it if they want. And that covers our intake form. So the next phase of our client flow is the interview. And here again, we can divide it out into two components. Remember the form we just talked about, our intake form, we're going to be reviewing this form. But importantly, while we're reviewing, we're also involving the client. We're talking to the client because it's an interview. So we're ensuring that the form is complete. If there are any blank questions that we are asking about that and filling in yes or no. We're going to ask about any questions marked unsure. As we talked about before, we're going to be with the client deciding whether that's a yes or no. We're going to be asking about information that seems to conflict. So sometimes they will have put in one section that they have a dependent and but they don't have any dependent care expenses. And so you might be, asking to see if they've forgotten something. There's also some things that are commonly forgotten. If somebody's marked down that they're a server, I always ask them, did you have any cash tips? Because that's something they might have forgotten that needs to be reported on their tax return, or things like bank interest, especially if you're signed up for e-services and you don't get a form in the mail. It's common to forget, oh yeah, there's some income there that I need to report on my income tax return. So again, as we talked about in our volunteer standards of conduct, this is where we are asking questions and doing our due diligence to make sure that we are understanding fully the taxpayer's situation. But we can do that without auditing. We don't have to see paperwork for absolutely everything. The example last time was, cash donations. We don't need to see that. We might kindly remind our taxpayers that they do need to have proof of that in case they were ever audited, but we don't have to see that. And then really importantly, we're doing all of this fact-finding, all of this interview process before we start the return in the software. Because if we get the return started and then start asking questions, what we might find is that this person has a source of income that is out of scope for us, or some other reason why we can't do the return, or they need to go and get some proof of something, some information about something, and they wouldn't be able to complete the process anyway. So we want to find all that stuff out beforehand before we waste their time. After the return has been prepared, we have our quality review. And we commonly refer to this as our second set of eyes. Again, we are using our intake form because it's the intake interview and quality review sheet. It helps organize your quality review so that you can make sure that you get everything. Again, with the quality review, you are involving the taxpayer, you're asking questions if you see things that conflict, in order to make sure that the return is prepared correctly. It needs to be performed on every return, and it needs to be performed, like we said before, with the correct certification level. So if you are certified at basic and the return is an advanced return and the return preparer was advanced, you still can't do the quality review if you only have the basic certification. You have to have the correct certification level. It's never performed by the original preparer, so even if the site was really busy, you would never perform your own quality review. As we talked about before, it involves the client. You need to be asking questions of the client if you see something that needs clarification. And there's also a checklist in Publication 4012. Remember, that's our big VITA resource that has a lot of the information that we're going to be looking for. There's a checklist in there that you follow to complete the quality review. Make sure that you are looking at everything and not forgetting some things. wrapping up the process, we make sure that we have done all of the components of our client flow. We've done our intake properly, we've filled out our intake form, we've done our interview properly, we've followed the intake form, and we've also engaged with our clients. The preparation has been done by a preparer who has the correct certification level, or if we're facilitated self-assist, that questions are being answered by volunteers with the correct certification level. We've done our quality review, and that is the person who was not the preparer of the return. Then we are just about ready to sign and send. We always remind our clients that the return is their responsibility, and so whatever is on the return, then they are, when they sign, they are saying that that return is accurate. So they need to be fully aware of what's on the return and agree with that before they sign and send. And of course, we're doing electronic filing, so signing is checking a box and sending is pushing a button.